A very warm welcome to you all this evening, and thanks very much for joining us, whether here in person or, of course, to those of you on the live stream. And first of all, I'm afraid, the usual housekeeping announcements. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm sounds, we'll take the doors behind you out onto Bedford Way, and those who can't use the stairs should move to the doors on the audience's left, and a fire marshal will assist you out of the building. For tweeters among you, the hashtag is #IOE Debates. That's all one word, #IOE Debates. And that's also the way that the audience on the live stream can put comments and questions to our panellists. So, to the debate. We've actually clocked up a large number now of these what-if debates, 14 in fact, since October 2017. And so far we've focused mainly on school-age young people and policy matters. This evening we're looking further along the education pipeline at higher education, and specifically who has access to that part of the sector. And of course, in many ways, that links back to the schools phase. Equally, university entry requirements have significant backwash effect on school education. And as HEPI have pointed out, competitive selection continues to be anathema in the school sector, but completely de rigueur and naturalised within HE. And the debate is inspired in part by a HEPI pamphlet published back in 2017 titled The Comprehensive University, an Alternative to Social Stratification by Academic Selection, which was written by Tim Blackman of Middlesex University. In place of our current system of selective university admissions, the pamphlet argued for mechanisms that would distribute applicants with different levels of prior attainment more evenly across the system, in the same spirit as comprehensive schooling. It was a thought-provoking piece, not least because of the way it put into sharp relief our attachment to stratification and elitism, as well as to notions of ability as relatively narrowly defined and fixed. It's undoubtedly the case that our higher education system is highly stratified. And over the last year or so, even the modest progress made to date on fair access seemed to fall into reverse, particularly among the most esteemed universities. The call for comprehensive universities is just one possible response to this seemingly intractable issue. Is it the best one? Or, remembering that this is about progression and outcomes as well as just access, are there other ways that we might finally achieve student intakes at our universities that are more representative of the society and the communities they serve? We have a fantastic panel to help us mull over those questions. But before I introduce our panellists, let me ask you a question here to the audience here in the room, and I'm going to need a show of hands, but I'm going to give you 4 options first. How should we encourage greater diversity in university students' intakes? And the options I'm going to propose to you are quotas, targets, funding incentives, or none of the above. Admissions should be based on prior attainment alone. So let's have a show of hands. Those in support of quotas. A few. Targets. Quite a few more. Thank you, Nick. Funding incentives. Oh yes, a lot more of those. Have we got higher education members in the audience, I think? Or none of the above? A couple. Okay, so we've got a good even distribution. We'll have a good debate here this evening, I think. And to help us with that, let me introduce our speakers. So here on my left, I have Nick Hillman, who's currently in his 5th year as Director of the Higher Education Policy Institute, HEPI, that I've already referred to. Prior to joining HEPI, Nick advised the then Minister for Universities and Science, David Willits, from 2007 to 2013. And that followed a stint as a history teacher with a near miss at becoming a Member of Parliament. And he's written extensively on higher education policy and politics, as well as on the Manchester music scene. Learning new things. Anna Vignoles, at the end of the panel here, is Professor of Education at the University of Cambridge, prior to which she was based here at the IOE, and we're delighted to welcome her back for this debate. Anna's research covers issues pertaining to equity in education, and she's pioneered the use of large-scale administrative data to study the interactions between pupil background and achievement, university access, and student outcomes. Anna's advised numerous government departments, not least the Department for Education. And Paul Jump has provided us with a commendably concise, or perhaps very modest, biography. That's the journalist, okay. Paul's features and opinions editor at the Times Higher Education, the THE, prior to which he was politics, law and governance reporter for Third Sector magazine and is a freelancer at The Guardian. And then on my left, Claire Fox is director of the Academy of Ideas, which she founded in order to create an accessible public space for the exploration of ideas. She also established a Debating Matters competition for sixth formers and a residential summer school, the Academy, with the aim of demonstrating university as it should be. Claire's a panellist on BBC Radio 4's The Moral Maze and a regular on the likes of Newsnight and Any Questions. So you can see that we have the right panellists in the room for a very stimulating debate, I hope. And without further ado, we're going to begin with Anna. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Becky, and thanks for the opportunity to come and talk about such an important topic. There are many ways, I think, that we need to diversify higher education, most obviously in terms of the students we admit, in terms of who teaches those students, and indeed in what we teach. But I'm going to focus my remarks on how we might diversify our student body. If we look to the past, one clear way that we've succeeded in diversifying the student body has been expansion. If you go back to the 1950s, you have just 3% of students going on to higher education. Currently, just under half enroll at least, even if not all graduate. And when we open the doors wider, it's undoubtedly true that we let in a more diverse set of people. And expansion has been particularly successful, I would argue, for example, in terms of women. If we go back to the 50s, only around about 1/5 of our undergraduate student body was female. Now we have actually the reverse issue, which is 2/3 of our student undergraduate body are female. But we've made far slower progress in diversifying to students from poorer backgrounds and from certain minority ethnic groups. It's important to be precise on this. The proportion enrolled in university from those groups has increased substantially over time. So if we go back to 1980, only about 6% of students from low-income households go to university. That's doubled, now 12% do. But that's not enough in terms of demonstrable progress. And of course, it remains true that the relative advantage of those from richer backgrounds remains invidiously substantial. So my conclusion is that whilst past experience is, as they say, no guarantee of future performance, expansion is really likely to be a tempting way to diversify the sector further. And I think we can also already see that in practice. We see at the moment, due to demographic factors, there are fewer students around to enroll. Universities are being remarkably proactive, making unconditional offers, quite tempting offers, financial offers, attempts to boost numbers. And that level of recruitment is indeed likely to provide some opportunity to diversify the sector. But what I would say is that we need to be asking ourselves two questions. The first question is further expansion desirable? And if so, what should it look like? The second question is, if it's not desirable to expand further, how can we nonetheless diversify our sector? So I'm going to start with option one. Let's assume we want to expand our way to a more diversified higher education. So I think this is a difficult option for one reason. Our work on the economics of the problem suggests that even as it stands, with nearly half the cohort enrolling, Students are taking degrees where the economic benefits, in terms of wages at least, are likely to be minimal. Students need to be aware of this. It's important. We are selling students from poor backgrounds short if we admit them to courses that don't give them access to the good jobs that they want to get. Obviously, and I'm going to repeat this because this is really important, obviously higher education is about far more than getting a good job. You can make perfectly cogent arguments about expanding higher education that do not rely on it being economically beneficial. However, in surveys and discussions with lower income students, it's very clear that students are enrolling because they aspire to the kinds of jobs that their more advantaged peers have got. And so, again, I say this, that students will feel shortchanged if those degrees don't get them access to the careers that they're after. So I think my answer on the expansion issue is, yes, it's possible to expand to a more diverse sector, but we need to be doing it carefully. We might consider expanding degrees where there's obvious labour market demand. That's one way to go. But actually, in our data, what we notice is that even within a particular subject, there's a huge variation in student outcomes. So what gets taught within a subject on a specific degree course at a specific institution makes a difference. And that actually gives us the potential to expand the sector, perhaps with the current array of subjects we offer, but thinking far more deeply about what kinds of skills we actually need in today's labour market. And there's tension there. Higher education colleagues may argue that we don't want our courses determined by the skills that employers want in the labour market. But nonetheless, it is something I think we need to think about if we're going to convince people that expansion is the route to go. But there is an elephant in the room here. If nearly half the student population head off to higher education, what we're actually saying is diversification means reaching out to the other half. And how do the other half fare in the education system? Most of them go through our further education system, actually. So the majority of the students we might want to diversify to are in further education. That is an underfunded, undervalued route. We need to acknowledge it far more than we've done in the past, and we need targeted and sustained investment from earlier in childhood, yes, but also through that critical phase as students take alternative routes into higher education. And we also need to make it far easier to take alternative routes and end up with a degree at the end of it, and to move within higher education once you're there, so more ladders up through the system. And the obvious ways that we might do that are expanding part-time provision, expanding vocational routes into higher education, and thinking very carefully about the relationship between degrees and apprenticeships, for example. And I would just add that if we do expand higher education in this direction, we might have the added advantage that we're bringing into the sector not only a more diverse set of students, but also students who often come in with really good employability skills, who've already got experience of the labour market and who can bring that into higher education to the benefit of other students. So that's one option. So now I'm going to turn to option 2, which is where we diversify, but we're not allowed to increase student numbers. What does that actually mean? Clearly, at some obvious and basic level, this means that we need to admit different students to our existing courses. And it's really important that we're crystal clear on that. What that means is we need to admit fewer rich students. We need to admit fewer women. We need to admit fewer white students. And we need to admit fewer able-bodied students. And this is really important because unless we face that, we don't really acknowledge the political difficulty of actually achieving that. How could we do it? I would argue that we can use contextualized admissions far more than we do. I think we need to use it actively and aggressively. But I would also say that if it's to have any legitimacy, it needs to be fair and data-driven. It needs to be transparent. So we need evidence on what factors should we take into account. Some students have a far easier ride into higher education. We need to allow for that when we're judging who to admit. And we also, just as critically, need to avoid gaming by students. And we can come back to what we mean by gaming, but we want genuine diversification, not diversification according to tick boxes. And so I'd end by just noting that I think universities have actually done a relatively poor job of studying their own sector. Ironically, few universities have invested actually in research into their own sector. UCL IOE being a notable exception. But this needs to be changed if we're going to have a rigorous evidence base to determine what contextualised admissions should really look like. And I think things are changing. I went to Essex yesterday and learned about their ESRC-funded project, very much focused on understanding their students' trajectories, researching their student body and researching diversification in their context. In my own institution, we now have an academic research program led by Dr. Sonia Illy, who's sitting in the audience there, and myself, which is trying to provide rigorous evidence on these issues. And I imagine more universities are going to go down this route. It's really important that we can justify the decisions we make on admissions. So in conclusion, I think we need to think simultaneously about the size and shape of the higher education sector that we want and that we can afford. We need to invest in alternative routes into higher education, and that means thinking seriously about investment in FE. And we need to be far more transparent and rigorous about the ways in which we're going to make decisions about who we admit into our sector. So thank you.
Anna, thank you so much. And Paul.
Thank you. So, yeah, I took the title of this debate quite seriously. So these are just my thoughts on what if we really wanted to diversify access to our universities. I realise there are issues with postgraduate admissions as well, which often get overlooked in these debates. I'm going to overlook them as well, I'm afraid, because we've only got 8 minutes. There's a certain sense in which, as Anna's alluded to, we've already gone quite a long way towards diversification. Only 5% of people went to university in the 1960s. Now it's nearly 50%, and clearly that has broadened the socio-economic background of those who do go. UCAS figures show that 20% of UK 18-year-olds from the poorest backgrounds went to university in 2017-18, and that's up from 11% in 2006. So that's progress. David Cameron set this target in 2015 to double the proportion of students from disadvantaged backgrounds admitted by 2020, from 13.6% in 2009 to 28% in 2020. That doesn't look like it's going to be met, but in a sense, the solution is obvious. Again, as Anna alluded to, it's expand. We just keep expanding and we'll keep diversifying. But yeah, problems are the cost of it, clearly. Also, as Anna alluded to, the sort of credential inflation argument that people really are just doing, some cases, doing degrees for which, they could previously have just walked into a job at 16. So is that really a good use of state resources? That's probably an argument for another day. But I think the more fundamental problem with that idea is it doesn't. The problem is that why we want diversification of university entry is to promote social mobility, presumably. That's why we're all exercised about it. And the fact is that, if you look at most of the relevant figures on this, social mobility is stagnating at a time when university entrance is expanding. And why is that? Well, it's because, in this country in particular, it matters so much where you go. It's not just about getting into university, it's about getting into the top universities. It's not only true in the UK, of course, the recent admissions scandal in the US, where various rich people were paying to get their kids into elite universities by falsifying all kinds of transcript items. Again, it's the same issue. It doesn't. There are lots of universities in the US, but there's only one Harvard, so everyone clamours to get in there. In the UK, the problems particularly start given the sort of mystique of Oxbridge. Even getting into a Russell Group university isn't really enough, is it? If you really want the top jobs, if you really want diversity at the top levels of society, you've got to diversify Oxbridge. And that's improved a little bit, but very little. Oxford admitted 56.8% of state school students in 2013. By 2017, it had gone up to 58.2, so it's about 1.5%. But of course, David Lammy revealed that 13 Oxford colleges made no offers at all to black students between 2010 and 2015. So clearly, they've got a long way to go. So, if we're on the expansion route, well, we could expand the Russell Group, perhaps expand Oxbridge in particular. Maybe it's hard. It hasn't expanded at all, really, in recent years. They admitted 3,300 undergraduates in 2016. That was only 50 more than they did in 2006. So while the sector in general has been expanding, Oxbridge hasn't at all. You know, they don't want to do it for their own reasons, partly because the cities are already so overcrowded and overpriced. There are plenty of practical reasons for that. So maybe you know, the key is to address the admission system of Oxbridge in particular and universities in general. I mean, again, you know, on the face of it, there's nothing wrong with admitting the kids with the highest predicted grades who do best in the interviews. You know, there's a sort of prima facie fairness about that. But then, of course, the disadvantage issues and poor schooling and all of that gets you into contextual admissions territory, or what the Telegraph calls social engineering. And, you know, that's the problem, isn't it? We can't even agree on how to describe it. You know, whether we use a positive term or a pejorative one. It's you know, there's sort of moral agony about it, really. I mean, I guess you know, the sort of holy grail is genuinely held to get to sort of genuine equality of opportunity, to sort of strip away all the social factors and admit people on the basis of pure talent. I mean, there are all kinds of problems with it, though. One is just the practical one, that domestic league tables, you know, rank universities partly on the basis of their entry tariff, so that's a big disincentive institutionally to do that. There are also much more philosophical problems, like distinguishing natural talent from sort of induced talent, and that's, of course, a problem that IQ testers have had. And then there's the preparation issue. You know, what if, you know, you admit kids on contextual admissions, but they're just not sufficiently well prepared for study? I mean, that's a controversial view, but for what it's worth, we have an article coming up from Martin Stephen, who's the founding governor of the London Academy of Excellence, which is a selective sixth form college in Newham. It's very successful at getting state school kids from poor backgrounds into universities. But, I mean, he sees the problem very much as being at school level rather than university level. He says the truth is that after 13 years of education in one of the richest countries in the world, disadvantaged students in England still largely lack the necessary knowledge base to allow them to thrive on a demanding university course. He may be wrong, but, you know, that is a problem. So foundation years, perhaps, but again, who's going to pay for that? You know, in an era of high fees, that's going to be a big issue. It's also worth bearing in mind that, you know, an alternative is to get towards the Tim Blackman piece. It's not, you know, it's not inevitable that we have to select on the basis of academic ability. I mean, even philosophically, you know, fairness doesn't necessarily mean equality of opportunity. It could just be equality of outcome, as the communists would have it. You know, there's a certain sense in which an inequality of natural talent is also unfair. So there's, you know, there is a basic kind of philosophical argument for the comprehensive university, apart from anything else. And, you know, it is quite common around the world. You know, in France, anyone who completes high school is entitled to attend university. They only use selection for oversubscribed courses. The downside of that is that they have huge dropout rates. And that's, you may be aware, there's been lots of controversy over Macron's attempts to sort of rein in some of this free-for-all and introduce more selectivity. And some in France have objected that you know, that's kind of anti-egalitarian. They forget all about the Grand Écoles, of course, which Macron is also sort of threatening to rein in as a way of appeasing the yellow jackets. But, you know, this is an option. It happens in the Netherlands as well, even Switzerland, which has very highly regarded universities. You know, just because a university is very highly ranked internationally doesn't mean it has to be very highly selective at undergraduate level. There are lots of examples that aren't. So, yeah, that gets us to comprehensive universities. I'll probably leave it at that. I've got more to say, but I know my time is up, so I'll leave the rest for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Paul. That's great. Thanks for your comment. And over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much. I always prefer to stand up when I'm talking, so unless the sound people at the back tell me to sit down, great. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak in this debate. I've attended these what-if debates before, but I've never spoken in one, so it's a real pleasure and an honour to be here. As Becky said, I head up HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute. We're the UK's only specialist higher education think tank. And we have a relationship with well over 100 institutions up and down the UK, including the IOE. And we really value that and are very grateful for the IOE's support. Now, we don't always agree with the IOE and the research done here, but we do learn a lot from the work you do here. I'm well aware, as the banners all over the place tell me, that this is the #1 place in the world to do education, and I believe it. Which takes me to my first point, really, which is we have an incredible hierarchy in our university system in the UK, and possibly particularly in England. And one of the conundrums that I wrestle with day in, day out, is that institutions like the IOE, whose research generally says the selection and hierarchy are really bad things to have in schooling, themselves operate on a basis by which assumes the selection and hierarchy are good things in higher education. And it is worth dwelling on that. And indeed, I'm often struck by how some of the most fervent campaigners against school selection seem to work in our most selective universities, the ones at the very top of the tree. And I could name names, but I'm going to avoid naming individuals. But to give you one specific example, as an organisation, HEPI, my organisation, was very roundly attacked recently by academics at the uber-selective University of Durham. And they were angry with us because we published a report which said that grammar schools are good at getting pupils to selective universities. I actually don't think that is an outrageous or controversial statement. It doesn't seem to me at all surprising that selective schools are quite good at preparing people for selective universities. It's their raison d'etre. But nonetheless, it angered a lot of people, including actually some people in this room, but it particularly angered these academics at Durham. And the reason they were so angry is because of something, which is true, by the way, and I accept it, and it was there in the report, which is that the average performance of children, pupils, in schools tends to be less good in selective areas than non-selective areas when you add all the children up and look at the performance overall. But you know, those very same researchers who were so angry about what we said about grammar schools and who said it's absolutely imperative we have no school selection at all, have a completely different attitude to the sector in which they and I and people like Becky alongside me work. Because in higher education, they don't want an equal sector with an end to hierarchy. They want, in fact, the sorts of solutions that Anna and Paul have already referred to. So, for example, in their very same people who attacked us for publishing this work on grammar schools published a paper just the other day funded by the ESRC saying that the solution in higher education was a whole bunch more of contextual offers. So you give entrants who have sort of disadvantaged flags lower A-level offers. It's been going on for decades in the sector, but it's done in a more professional way now than it used to happen, so that those students have a better chance of reaching universities like Durham. But you know, that would solidify the hierarchy in our sector, rather than delivering the sort of structural change that those very same researchers want to see in schooling. And I also note, by the way, in passing, listening to Anna, whose work is, it's phenomenally brilliant. So I'm not going to pick any arguments with Anna on her work. But I just note one thing in passing, which is if, for example, we have far more contextualized offers than we have currently, and I'm not opposed to them on principle in any way, they rely on A-level grades. And we've shown recently in a blog that deserves far more attention than it's got. 1 in 4 A-level grades in this country are wrong. And what I mean by wrong is if a senior examiner were to remark them, the grade would change. And therefore, putting a massive onus on the sort of data-driven world that Anna is talking about is quite a risky thing, at least to do in the short term. And that brings me to Tim Blackman's work for us that's been referred to. And it's a brilliant piece of work. It's one of the things I'm proudest to have published during my 5 years at HEPI. And as you've heard, he turns current arguments on their head. And he says what's good for schools would be good for higher education too. Less hierarchy, less selection, more local provision so people pop along to their local institution rather than going away. In other words, if comprehensive schools are good, why not comprehensive universities too? And in that model, as you've heard, universities would be much more similar to one another as happens in other countries. And lecture halls, the argument also goes, would be as diverse as classrooms, and we know that diverse classrooms can lead to better learning outcomes. So it's a very persuasive and interesting, powerful argument, and it shows you, when you read it, how different our current HE system is to those in other countries. So as I say, I'm proud to have published it. It's very thought-provoking, but I actually want to make a different case. And it's because I think there's a problem with comprehensive universities, at least in our situation, in our country, which Professor Blackman himself does identify in his report. And it's Oxbridge, and the influence of the Oxbridge model throughout the UK system. Because I think we actually lost the argument for having an equal set of universities 800 years ago when Oxford was founded. And in the next 600 or so years, when Oxford and Cambridge stopped other towns and cities from having universities, which meant we ended up with two universities that are much older, much more traditional, much more elite than the rest of the sector. And what it did was it cemented a particular form of higher education in the UK, most notable for its residential model, where you move away from home. I call it the boarding school model of higher education. And it was embedded in newer universities in all sorts of ways too, by building lots of halls of residence, by the UCA, we're now called UCAS, of course, a national admission system which most countries don't have, by generous maintenance grants and now loans, which means people can move away from home. So I fear we're actually 802 years late to implement a completely different sort of HE system. And so my argument for what would we do to diversify university admissions radically would actually be not totally dissimilar to Anna and Paul's. Expand, expand, expand. And I put my hand up when Becky gave us the options at the beginning for the target option. Because now that we've reached Tony Blair's target of 50% of young people reaching higher education before the age of 30, I think we should set another target. I've argued for 70% target. Some people might say 80%. And when I argued that, I got some really classy abuse online. But I stand by it. Because I think those people who oppose expansion of higher education use arguments incredibly similar to those used in history when the school leaving age was put up first to 11 and then to 12, then to 14, then to 15, and then to 16. And those arguments are as unconvincing now as they were then. And if we don't accept what I'm saying, if we don't accept that the residential model, the live away from home when you're young model of higher education as the norm, I worry we will end up with a halfway house. I worry that we will end up in a world in which rich people still have the choice of all the universities in the country and can choose where they go. But poor people, to use shorthand, have to stay at home and have a very limited choice. But of course, the residential model is super expensive, as Paul said. And it's why we in the UK adopted student loans before other European countries. And it's why we've expanded their coverage so much. And I believe the financial model is the right one because it allows that expansion to happen and the removal of student number controls. And if Jeremy Corbyn were ever to win and to abolish fees, as he said he would, I guarantee you both the quality and the quantity of higher education would suffer. So to conclude, the most urgent thing I think we can do is expand, expand, expand. And for me, the widening participation debate, in other words, how many people go, is more important than the fair access debate, which is really about how many people get to do PPE at Oxford and other very selective institutions. Let's have that debate, but it's less important than the numbers in the system as a whole. And one very final comment, given our venue. If, and returning to what I said at the start, if as a higher education sector we are not prepared to row back on selection in our own sector, then tactically we need to become much more self-aware when we attack selection in schools. Because do as I say, not as I do, is the single least persuasive political argument that exists. And it's doomed to failure for another reason too, which is that it is the uber selection we have in our university system that drives the demands for selection in the school system. Schools are responding to the university system and what happens at 18. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. And Claire.
So I'm not a policy person, and I found the introductions very interesting, but I'm just going to try and throw in a few curveballs or a few thoughts. The first question I think that lurks behind this, that I don't think we have established yet as a society, is what are universities for? I don't think we agree on that, and unless we do, then we can't decide what we're offering access to. 50% going to universities is a good thing, is it? Why? When I went to university, I wanted to storm the ivory towers and remove all social barriers and any discriminatory practices at all on behalf of my peers from a comp in North Wales. But that was for those people who wanted to go to university, who wanted to live the life of the mind and who wanted to explore ideas and pursue knowledge. And I think that it's hugely important that we always bear in mind that that would be what we'd want to do. But do we really think that going to university should be or is the right solution for everybody or a majority, or who's decided that and why? And I don't think it is for everybody. I don't think everybody wants to study at a higher level. And to then change universities in order to have more people go to them and then say, well, it's too difficult for people who don't want to study at a higher level, so we'll change universities, means that they're not going to something called a university, really. It's just a con. I think one of the most distasteful aspects of the social mobility discussion at the moment is that for those 50% of people who don't go to university, they're looked down on as though they're failures. You know, anybody who doesn't go to university. So it's not a diverse system of society where you have some people who suitably want to pursue the life of the mind at university and then whole ranges of other diverse ways of living. I think, therefore, that we have to be careful that we remember that what really creates social mobility is a dynamic economy, a future-orientated industrial policy, a thriving further education sector, all sorts of things. It's not universities per se. Diversity, how can you oppose it? But why has diversity become such an unchallengeable value? I think that potentially diversity as an end undermines what universities are for in terms of the pursuit and expansion of knowledge for its own sake, which is where I stand on universities. And diversity as a policy often strangles free and open academic inquiry and it makes it less diverse. There's a really interesting book that I read recently called The Tribe, The Liberal Left and the System of Diversity by a Labour activist, Ben Cobley. And he talks about diversity as a machine-like system, rigid, that ends up as an end, box ticking that can lead to illiberal, institutionalised elevation of identity over merit. It's a great book and you should read it. But why it made me think so much is because it made you realise that diversity is something that you nod through without really thinking why, what are we talking about, and can be not necessarily a good thing. One diversity that's often neglected in universities today, of course, is diversity of opinion. And I think a kind of groupthink in universities can actually put off a lot of people who wanted to go to universities because there's only one way to think there. Universities today have been torn apart, in my opinion, by major free speech disputes, issues around safe spaces and dissenting views being considered to be offensive and no platformed. I think it's become the home of groupthink and echo chambers, and I wrote a book about that. And at the heart of that safe space university model, again, what is a university for? Some people would say it should be a safe space for people to have a protected space where students can feel comfortable, and safe space where you don't hear arguments you don't like. That can mean that you're actually banning a diverse range of viewpoints, and the only views that you will get will be those of your own reflected back onto you. And I think there is a problem of a kind of young people living in a filter bubble and being bubble wrapped away from challenging and unpleasant things that they don't want to hear. So Mark Leland made a point. He's the professor of humanities at Columbia University. He wrote an article called The End of Identity Liberalism after Trump got elected. And he said that the fixation on diversity in America had produced a generation of liberals and progressives narcissistically unaware of the conditions outside their self-defined groups and indifferent to the task of reaching out to Americans of every walk of life. And I fear that, in fact, that kind of groupthink at universities here means that there is 50% of people who are not interested in what's happening to the people outside it, which is ironic if you're trying to kind of diversify. There was a good article in The Guardian in 2017, September. It was anonymous for reasons the title illustrate. I voted for Brexit. Why do academic colleagues treat me like a pariah? And it went on to say that too often colleagues assume that everyone in academia shares their political outlook. They leave tropes about respecting diverse opinions in the seminar settings, while actually dissent is often and easily met by passive aggression. In the London Review of Books, Cambridge professor David Runciman described colleagues who said that they'd voted for Brexit, who came out as voting for Brexit, as brave. I mean, this was a majority view in the rest of the country, just to point out, and I thought, well, you know, if professors at Cambridge University think that you have to be brave to admit you voted Leave, can you imagine what it would feel like for people who are not in a university setting? Think about this. We talk about having a diverse range of students. We go to hard-to-reach communities, non-traditional students. We have access schemes for public engagement. We have listening projects to hear what people from different socio-economic backgrounds might think about the world. And then when, as it happens, mechanics, care workers, the unemployed, non-voters, and people who are not degree educated go out and vote the wrong way, we as academics treat them like dirt, tell them they're ignorant and tell them they're stupid. So I think that might put off the odd person from going to universities. The final thing I wanted to just talk about completely separately is the idea of diversity in the context of the growth of identity politics, because I think that it can be quite divisive. And I think that there's a danger that diversity actually encourages students to identify by their protected characteristics, and I don't think that's very helpful. If in administrative terms you see diversity and start counting people as to whether they're white, LGBTQ, trans, black, women, whatever, I think that diminishes the humanity and the individuality and essentialises people that you're trying to recruit to university. And it suggests that their experience is contained within a group context, fossilises identity and strips people of agency. And I think that it also encourages people to display their identity as objectification and objectify it. And so I get nervous then that that will have an impact on the curriculum and what universities are for. And in fact, we've seen the rise of a divisive, particularist epistemology in terms of university curriculum coming into play with a real challenge to the universalism of knowledge around different identity groups. And you'll be familiar with some of the My Curriculum is Too White, decolonising the curriculum and so on, the idea that certain texts will be psychologically damaging to different identity groups, and this demand that somehow different identity groups should see themselves in the subjects that they're taught, otherwise their self-esteem will be damaged. So I think that that means that university education being opened up to greater numbers is a fantastic thing if people want to go there. But if you do it through the prism of identity and diversity in that particular way, then you're basically asking a university to change itself and its curriculum to attract different type of people, make them feel comfortable according to the different identity groups that exist. And so I suppose the big question still lurks in me is what are universities for? And until we get there, then I think that we shouldn't just nod through a diverse university system, because I don't think that we understand what diversity really is.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks so much to the panellists. That's been an incredibly wide-ranging discussion, drawing in a huge number of really challenging issues. I mean, we've had the challenge, which is a very good question, what is university for? So what are we trying to provide access to, which I think is a very valid challenge at the heart of this debate. We've had lots of different ideas about how we might go about making our universities more reflective of society, which I don't think people would argue with, particularly though, given another dilemma, the human capitalist perspective about the impact that attending particular university institutions can have on future life, or conversely, the exclusion from that. But then, of course, we come back to this philosophical question about, well, what is university for? Is it about, realising life outcomes financially, or is it about the life of the mind? And then we've had this challenge related to that about selectivity. I mean, one of the things haunting this debate, and Nick has alluded to it directly, and others in passing as well, is of course university league tables. Nick, I can assure you that the UK is not the most stratified university system. I mean, if you go to parts of Asia, and including notably China here, the league tables matter to a phenomenal amount. And in the case of the UK, of course, money follows league table positions. This is the trouble, both in the school sector but also in higher education, that once you unleash league tables, it's very hard to escape again, which of course comes back to the Blackman comprehensive university ideal. This would now be genuinely very radical. So, of course, we want to hear from the audience. I'm looking, of course, for your challenges. I know that you'll have questions for the panel, but also radical ideas that you may have for widening participation and access. So over to you, the audience. And I'll take, as usual, collections of questions. So if you can say who you are and keep your questions short and to the point, we'll have the opportunity for more. We've got a gentleman here. Any more hands? Burning questions? Well, we'll start with you then, sir.
Hi.
Could you say who you are?
I'm Bright. I've just worked for the Student Centre at UCL. My first question, it's actually, I think it's a quick observation. We're talking about diversity, but I'm sure many people have observed that the panel, obviously, is not as diverse as we would hope. And I do wonder sometimes if that's where we need to start the conversation from, that in terms of thinkers coming up with ideas of diversity, it might be a good idea to have a diverse panel. The other one is for who I think Anna touched on earlier on. She made, I think you listed a couple of things about if we're very serious about diversity, we need to look into decreasing the amount of women, able bodies, why? And the question I have is, does that mean that for us to have a diverse university, we need to give in on something? Does diversity mean that something needs to go?
Anna, would you? Well, shall I start with just a note on your first point? The point's very well made. I mean, if you look at our prior debates, we do try to ensure diverse panels. We also try to balance with expertise and so forth. And the focus today was very much on this sort of notion about WP, but you're absolutely right. There's an irony, I think, in having diversity and then an all-white panel. So thank you for that. Anna.
That's absolutely the right question, and that's why I put it in that rather stark form. I think we have a tendency to sort of gloss over the arguments. If you are intending to diversify the higher education sector in its current form with no further expansion, then absolutely it means that some people need to step aside. And the question is who? Well, obviously, you would try to, the whole point of diversification would be to admit students that are more representative of society as a whole, and perhaps specifically to admit students who have huge potential but through circumstances beyond their control have not had such an easy ride to higher education. But if you're thinking about targets or quotas or numbers, you are talking about admitting fewer women and fewer white people, fewer able-bodied people. That's what diversification would mean if you can't expand the sector. And I think that's why three of the speakers fundamentally have argued, at least partially, in favour of some expansion, precisely because it is most likely to achieve diversification. And my only point on expansion is expansion can mean many different things, and it depends what the sector looks like at the end of it. And some of our debate and some of our discussion is very much in the past. We have a sort of a view of what universities are like, and even as we speak, we have universities doing such a diverse range of things out there. And, you know, yet actually a lot of what we talk about relates to the Russell Group, for example.
Can I say something, though? I suppose that your question, which is well asked, but also raises, in a way, my question about what we mean by diversity. I mean, is this not a diverse panel? Have we checked people's socio-economic backgrounds, their sexuality, whether they have disability or not? Do we mean by diversity ethnic diversity? Is that the accusation? The reason I'm saying that is because I feel as though there's constantly this kind of negotiation about, have we got types? And I say that in all humility, because I'm not suggesting I should be here, right? I mean, that's fair enough to challenge what a panel's made up of and who's on the panel, but from the point of view of their views, surely, and we want diverse views. I just get very nervous about saying we've got this person, and the reason I'm saying that was because I actually went to and spoke at a diversity workshop in which there was a very diverse, in the box-ticking sense, group of people, and they all absolutely agreed with each other. And when I said something, they said, well, that's, you know, that I stood out as having a different view that group didn't like, but on paper it was diverse. But if you've all got the same opinion and come from the same groupthink or worldview, is that diverse, really? So that's why I at least want us to not feel intimidated into just saying diversity is a good thing and be clear about what it is we're saying.
But I think, just coming back to that, Claire, I suppose the challenge is, and I think luckily we do have social class diversity here, but the concern is that if you have people all from the same background always representing and speaking, then you won't get a broader range of views, which is why we do want to try to ensure that there's diversity on panels and so on, to reflect broader society. And I suppose that again is particularly resonant to this particular debate, where, as I say, it comes back, unfortunately, to life chances and this dilemma that university education is not just about the life of the mind, however important that is. It does also have a bearing on people's future life chances, which is why, of course, the debate is also so laden and of course, so complex. And I think this point that characterises, of course, all social mobility debates, where, again, this idea about balancing some kind of notion of meritocracy and equality of opportunity is also difficult, is that, of course, as we all know, if there is to be access to a limited number of opportunities, some people must move aside or go down in terms of mobility in order for others to raise up. And this is, of course, makes things very politically challenging. Let's go back to the audience. You don't want to hear from me, and now we've got lots of hands. So, gentleman at the front, two in the middle. And in terms of diversity, I'm hoping some women will put their hands up soon.
Hello. In terms of diversification... Do you want to just
say who you are?
I do beg your pardon. I'm Dr. Roger Ashton Griffiths. I have a visiting chair in India. In terms of diversity, it seems to me that one of the problems which has already been identified is that the system itself remains highly stratified. And it occurs to me in the 50 years or so since Robbins, a number of things have changed in society. We click every trip, we don't drink drive, we have gay rights, we have anti-race laws and so on. And yet nobody's made any attempt whatsoever to deal with societal attitudes towards stratification in the university system. And it seems to me that until that's taken care of, until people cease seeing the Oxbridge brand as the thing that matters above all else, then there's no possibility of real functional diversity occurring. And a corollary of that, incidentally, and it works both ways, is that it's necessary also to install in some of the new universities staff of, frankly, somewhat better quality than are there already.
Thank you very much. We'll hold that comment. There was a gentleman behind.
My name is Wael Amer. I'm a doctoral student at IOE. My question is about international students. To what extent do they bring diversity to higher education in the UK? And to what extent are they considered in the policy making and in the academic research?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And one more in front of, I'll take you in the next round. Lindsay.
Hello, John Butcher from the Open University. I'm in the 50th anniversary of the Open University, which I'll remind the panel has never had selection, and the sun still comes up in the morning, so that's interesting. I just think the problem here in addressing this question must be that the sector is completely infatuated with going on to higher education at the age of 18. There's a long history in open access and adult education and distance education in which that kind of situation is challenged, and I think that is a really good way of diversifying through flexibility.
Thank you very much. Excellent points. So who would like to comment first of all on Oxbridge? Paul, perhaps you'd like to.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, even if you had comprehensive admissions, there'd still be a big question about how those are actually administered. I mean, if there were any kind of geographical criteria, the way there are with selective schools, clearly people would gain that, and Oxford house prices would become even higher than they are already. And the thing is, I mean, it would work much better if universities were sort of seen as being kind of on a similar level of prestige, the way they are in countries like Switzerland and the Netherlands, where they're all quite good. None of them are kind of in the top 10, and neither of them are lower than about 200 in the world. So while that sort of sense of hierarchy exists in Britain, which is largely driven by research, not the teaching side of it, I think there'll always be a huge scramble to get into the historically prestigious universities, even if, on paper they're no longer so selective at undergraduate level.
Thank you. Nick, on international students, do they represent diversity?
Absolutely. I mean, incredibly important. Our three biggest pieces of work during my time in charge of HEPI have been on the contribution international students make, and they're more important here than in other countries, in my opinion, because we are so bad at emitting students, sending Brits abroad, in other words. So 10 times as many come here as we send abroad, and we're so bad at learning languages. So diversity on campus is incredibly important. And while we're on diversity, I mean, I absolutely take the point about the panel. I've got to say, however, I probably do about 90 speeches a year. This will probably be only one of two in the past year where there's more than 50% women, if my maths is right, 60% women. So diversity comes in, and I would take diversity across the series as a whole, but maybe that just shows how far behind we are in the HE sector. But 60% women on an HE panel is bloody good going, believe you me, and unusual. And maybe that, as I say, that just shows how far behind we are. Can I just do the stratification point? Because this is a really important point the gentleman in the front made, saying we haven't tackled stratification since Robbins. He's absolutely right, of course. But, there have been some attempts to do it. And the government have tried to do it through the Teaching Excellence Framework. The Teaching Excellence Framework is designed to turn existing league tables on their head to show pockets of excellence, or more than pockets, across the whole sector. And the sector are united in condemning it as a metric. So, I think if we think it's a terrible way of doing it, we need something better that grapples with the same challenge, because that is what it's trying to do. And so it is the 50th anniversary of the OU. So John Butcher's work is amazing on part-time students. But the OU is an amazing institution, and Tim Blackman is influenced by it in his work. But it's also part of the problem. Part of the reason our other universities don't do all this stuff is because they say we don't need to, the OU exists. And they use it in the famous phrase of Martin Trow, I think it was, who said it's a safety valve. It's a safety valve for the rest of the sector. So the existence of the OU is a good thing, but it protects the rest of the sector from changing.
Thank you. Let's have another round of questions. We had Lindsay here at the front, gentleman with his hand up at the back, and then the lady in the green top.
Hi, Lindsay Macmillan, Institute of Education. I'm going to stay away from the selection stuff for the time being and ask the panel about a couple of other things, if that's okay. Given the stratification that exists in the system, dare I mention the dirty word of lotteries? And I'd like to know the panel's opinion. Lee Elliott Major's been talking a lot about lotteries and higher education access. I know it's been tried a few times in the school system with a few examples of it working. Could it work in HE? The second thing that I'd like to suggest is, Nick, you mentioned briefly the problem with A-level grades generally not being correct. But you didn't mention the fact that actually the whole system's based also on predicted grades, which is even more problematic. And what about moving towards a post-qualifications admission system where, in fact, people were given a chance to actually get what they get rather than relying on people predicting? You know, Jill Wyness has done some work which has shown that high-achieving, low-income students are systematically under-predicted. And I think this is part of the problem.
Thank you. So, great points. Thank you, Lindsay. Gentleman here.
Hi, Charlie Heintoff, Policy Officer at the Association of Commonwealth Universities. Kind of following on from that point, not only do we assume that everybody entering higher education is at 18 has just done A-levels. I was wondering what, not only do we need to look at people from alternative qualifications as well, and how do, not everyone has done an A-level, if they've done a qualification from Wales, from Scotland, from Northern Ireland, or a BTEC, or alternative qualifications, and how that fits in. And also, the second question is, I was wondering if the panel sees this characterization that one of the panelists mentioned of universities being these illiberal spaces, because certainly being a recent student myself and working in the university sector, I don't recognize that characterization at all. That actually that this is a very vibrant sector, and that where students want to bring up a change in the curriculum, or want to discuss the idea that maybe that their reading list shouldn't be full of old white men, that how quickly this is shot down. And so I just wanted to kind of like ask the panelists what their thoughts are on that particular characterization of universities.
Thank you very much. And, sorry, yeah.
I'm Jenny Gibson from the Faculty of Education at Cambridge University, and I wanted to ask about FE and how we might make that attractive to middle-class parents, because I just think if we improve FE provision, maybe just all the poor kids will end up there and keep the status quo at university level.
Thank you very much. So, Claire, what about FE? What's your views there?
Yeah, so I taught in FE for many years. That's one of the things I'm interested in. And I was thinking about it with the question or the point about Open University and some of these points, because I used to teach, apart from anything else, on access courses for non-traditional students to go to university. But I also taught many people at FE who did not want to go to university, and I hope that we gave them a really good education. But near the end of the time that I was teaching in further education, a lot of the students who were at further education were applying to universities that were effectively FE colleges that have become universities and were rubbish. I mean, in truth. And so one of the things I wanted to ask about stratification is, it's not just a question of like, why do we hold this university in higher esteem than this one? I mean, sometimes it's because it's better. And I'm worried about selling people a pup. And what happens is if you kind of keep saying that, let's get rid of the stratification, and even the teaching excellence versus the research excellence, I mean, the danger here is that universities become like a kind of extension of school. And I think there's an infantilization happening of many students in some ways. And, you can be taught well, but you're meant to become independent at university. You leave school, you become an independent scholar, it's different. And if it's not different, so one of the things that characterises difference, of course, is that it's a research community that you enter into and that you become an apprentice in that research. Now, people will say to me, oh, you're just old-fashioned, that's not what it's like. But I'm concerned about universities being holding pens for young people that society doesn't have enough jobs for, and we have the nerve to say you're getting an education while we're doing it, and we're just basically conning them, right? So that is not the, thing that I am passionate, I love the Open University, which is it basically says this is a special thing that you can do at any age, but it's not the same as just doing something else, right? It's a very specific thing. Open University courses will always have the highest standards and open and so on and so forth. So I'm worried about, you know, desperate self-loathing of the fact that we're so frightened that we're putting people off university, that we actually end up saying, look, this is university. And I just, why? What for? You know, you don't have to go to university to be a decent citizen, to be smart, to be bright. So then the FE point is, further education colleges should be brilliant, wonderful, distinct places. Got nothing to, there should be more jobs. You know, there should be a whole different future. We should be having a different conversation.
Thank you,
basically.
Anna, well, you want to come in on that, but also I'd like to ask you about the characterisation about universities. Is this something that you, as a scholar, recognise in terms of teaching and so forth?
Yeah, so there's a lot of complicated questions there. One of the things that we're talking about a sector which is undeniably hierarchical. We've talked about league tables and research rankings. But underneath it all, the labour market also does its thing. And what's really interesting, I think, is that the labour market may move ahead of attitudes. So you were talking about sort of people aspiring to Oxbridge. If you look at labour market information, for example, on the highest earners, they're not necessarily, in fact, they're not from Oxbridge. They're from an institution not a million miles down the road called London School of Economics. More crucially, and perhaps more seriously, if you look at the value of certain apprenticeships, they now are much greater in the labour market. They have much more labour market value than many of the degrees that are on offer in the higher education sector. And so what is happening is that there is change going on, and inevitably, if routes through to the labour market start shifting and changing, people will respond to that, but the system is slow to respond. Undeniably, the middle class parent, no doubt, still has a negative view of FE, but I noticed the alacrity with which many students, middle class ones particularly, are leaping into degree apprenticeships and other variants on vocational education and training, because actually, in some areas, that's where you're going to get the biggest labour market value. So in terms of the characterisation of higher education, I think the point made earlier about selection is one that everybody's avoided. Imagine a world where we selected one-year-olds into different institutions and we'd all be unhappy with that. We think that maybe at 11 it's too early, and why would you do that? Are we suggesting that by the time we go to postgraduate level, we want open access to PhDs? And people will have different views as to where that line is drawn. I would point out, though, that the line is drawn well before you get to higher education, maybe in response to our higher education system. So GCSEs and A-levels are definitely ways of selecting students into different routes. And from my perspective, what's absolutely critical, which speaks to the OU point, is there has to be routes back and there have to be routes across. It has to be possible for someone who doesn't necessarily do the conventional high academic route at the age of 18 to come in and end up with a PhD in astrophysics if they're capable of it. That doesn't, however, mean that you let anybody, regardless of their academic preparation, take a degree in astrophysics.
Thank you. Colleagues, we are unfortunately running out of time. Nick, one word, lotteries, yes or no?
For HE, I think we already have a lottery. If you get into this tiny bottom of the funnel at Cambridge or Oxford, it's already a lottery. I'm a former secondary school teacher. It's already a lottery. We already have a lottery. It's just an unfair lottery, and a lottery in which some people can buy more tickets than others, but it is already pretty random how you get into places at the top of our sector. I'm not a massive fan of lotteries because I don't think they feel fair to voters.
Oh, thank you. That was very quickly wound up. Very good. It's been a hugely wide-ranging debate, and there's so much more to say, and I know you've got so many more questions as well. We've got good conversation going online as well. A couple of comments here. Kirsty J is responding to Claire. Where's the evidence, as stated by Claire Fox, diversity limits academic freedom? I haven't seen it. Michelle Turner on Facebook says, again, coming back to the school system, it's a waste of time addressing fair access and data-driven admissions because the path for HE or not is set years before, right back in early years where the gap is. So again, coming back to that inequality right from the early years. And we had a Twitter poll, should our universities be comprehensive rather than selective in their student intakes? Interestingly, the biggest supporting response was yes, they should be comprehensive, 41% supporting that, with only 30% no. So it sounds as though the debate will go on. I'm sorry that we've timed out, but I know that you'll enjoy discussing this afterwards. Thank you so much for attending, and do please join me in a final thanks to our panel.
Thank you.